On July 25, 1944, the morning air over St. Lo was cold and sharp, carrying the scent of wet earth and metal. Sergeant Dietrich Bauer checked his watch for the third time. His men huddled in their foxholes with half-eaten rations, muttering quietly to one another to stave off the creeping tension. For weeks, they had listened to the distant thunder of artillery and the whistle of incoming shells, learning to read the battlefield like an open book. But this morning felt different. An eerie calm pressed down over the fields, a silence so unnatural it made the hairs on Dietrich's neck stand on end. He tried to shake the unease, telling himself it was just nerves, just the anticipation of another skirmish. And then it happened. At once, with no warning, the earth roared in 1,000 directions simultaneously. Shells tore through the air, exploding in mid-flight like some unholy orchestra conducting death with perfect precision. Men who had been standing moments before disappeared in a single heartbeat, swallowed by plumes of dirt and fire. Vehicles twisted and flipped as though gravity itself had abandoned them. The shockwave rolled outward, knocking soldiers unconscious 50 meters from the nearest impact, leaving those who crawled from the craters trembling and screaming in disbelief. Dietrich barely had time to react. His foxhole shuddered as a massive eruption of earth threw him against the jagged walls, scraping his hands and bruising his shoulders. He watched through dust-choked air as comrades he had shared bread with the night before were gone. Nothing left but smoking craters and the echoes of a world violently unmade. Somewhere in the chaos, a private cried out, his voice small and human against the overwhelming roar of destruction, and Dietrich felt a sickening, almost surreal weight settle over his chest. How could something so precise, so total, exist? He had been trained to anticipate artillery, to read its patterns, to survive its predictable rhythm, but there was no pattern here. This was not artillery. This was annihilation delivered with the cold calculation of a mathematician. As the smoke and dust began to thin, Dietrich struggled to his feet. Blood and grime streaked across his face. His mind reeled, trying to understand what he had just witnessed. Somewhere across the field, a lieutenant counted bodies, his hands shaking, whispering curses under his breath, trying to reconcile the impossible numbers. There was no sound now, only the ringing silence that seemed to press against the ears, a silence that carried a truth worse than any explosion. This was a weapon that had stripped the world of warning, of choice, of chance. It didn't matter how fast a man could dive, how clever his position, how brave his heart. This weapon ignored all of it. And in that moment, as Dietrich staggered among the shattered earth and twisted steel, he realized the terrifying truth. This was not a bomb forged from metal or fire. It was something far more precise, far more merciless. A mathematical weapon, orchestrated with such cunning that the battlefield itself seemed to obey its logic, leaving no room for error, no space for survival, and no hope for those caught in its perfect, horrifying storm. Every soldier knows the sound of incoming shells, the distant whistle, the thump of earth exploding somewhere ahead, the precious seconds that stretch like lifelines. Those seconds are everything. A chance to dive, to flatten yourself against the dirt, to hope that luck favors you. But on this day, in the fields outside St. Lo, those seconds vanished. The Americans had asked a question no army had dared before. What if there was no warning at all? What if time itself could be stolen from the enemy? In makeshift command posts far behind the front, officers studied maps and data with the precision of mathematicians. They ran experiments on reaction times, noting how long a man could stand, how quickly he could drop, and how the first shell often decided life or death. 8 seconds of warning could save a life. Remove those 8 seconds, and the battlefield became a slaughterhouse. The calculations were intricate, each gun's distance measured, its shell's flight time precisely accounted for. A battery 3 miles away would fire first, another 5 miles distant seconds later, a massive howitzer 8 miles off timed to complete the deadly symphony. When the countdown ended, hundreds of shells landed in perfect, simultaneous chaos. To the German soldiers, it was incomprehensible. They had trained to anticipate, to read patterns, to survive the predictable rhythm of artillery. But here, the rhythm had been erased. The sky itself seemed to conspire against them, delivering devastation faster than their senses could register. Men who had been running for cover froze, caught in a world where instinct was meaningless. The concept was terrifyingly elegant. A barrage that left no warning, no chance, no escape. And as the dust settled, commanders and soldiers alike realized what had truly happened. This was not a faster gun, nor a more powerful shell. The Americans hadn't invented a new weapon in the traditional sense. They had invented a way to delete reaction time itself. The battlefield was no longer a place of seconds and instincts. It was a calculated storm of inevitability, where survival depended not on courage, but on being somewhere else entirely before the first shell struck. While Europe braced itself for the rumble of tanks and the roar of guns, in the windswept plains of Oklahoma, a different kind of war was being waged. It wasn't fought with soldiers or tanks, but with slide rules, stopwatches, and chalk-dusted maps. At Fort Sill, a small cadre of officers believed that the future of battle wasn't just courage. It was calculation. Major Carlos Brewer arrived with ideas so radical that some dismissed him as reckless, but he saw a flaw in traditional artillery. It was slow, cumbersome, and bound by the predictable rhythms of the past. Brewer's vision took shape under the watchful eye of his successor, Major Orlando Ward, who invented what would become the heart of modern artillery, the Fire Direction Center. Instead of each gun laboring independently, a single command could orchestrate dozens of guns across a battlefield, each shell timed to perfection. Radios replaced fragile telephone lines, allowing forward observers to ride with infantry and call in coordinates in real time. German artillery relied on systems trapped in the previous century, slow to respond, bound by telephones that were easily cut, and ammunition that didn't always match their guns. The difference was stark. While a German battery might take 12 minutes to respond to a threat, an American one could strike in under 3. The advantage wasn't merely technology. It was systems thinking, coordination, and the ruthless application of mathematics to destruction. By the time the enemy realized they were under fire, it was already too late, their positions obliterated before they could react. Germany fought with courage and tactics, their soldiers brave and well-trained, but America fought with systems and speed. And in that contrast lay the seed of an unstoppable force, a methodical and invisible hand that would turn the chaos of war into a calculated storm of inevitability. In the patchwork fields of Normandy, hedgerows hid more than the stubborn defenses of entrenched soldiers. They hid the illusion of safety. Across the European theater, generals had heard tales of American artillery in North Africa, and even Rommel himself had admitted the uncanny speed and precision of the barrages. But nothing could have prepared them for the sheer scale of what awaited in France. The Americans had perfected coordination to an art form, turning each battlefield into a machine of destruction. Every gun a cog in a system designed to overwhelm the senses and shred the mind. At Hill 192, the 2nd Infantry Division faced German defenders who had repulsed every previous assault. Then the storm fell. TOOT bombardments, meticulously timed, rained down shells with terrifying precision. Every few hours, positions that seemed safe erupted simultaneously in fire and smoke, the earth shuddering under the weight of hundreds of shells. Sleep became impossible. Supply lines were shredded before they could reach their destinations. Troops could not rotate, could not regroup, could not escape. And when Operation Cobra unleashed the full fury of air power followed by the relentless pounding of artillery, the Germans realized their defenses were no match for a force that could strike from sky and ground in perfect harmony. General Fritz Bayerlein, a seasoned veteran of the Eastern Front, could only watch in disbelief. The field looked like a moonscape, tanks overturned, communication lines destroyed, men scattered and broken. He wrote afterward, "Hell is not as bad as what we experienced." In the span of a single morning, elite divisions, veterans of countless campaigns, vanished into smoke and chaos. Normandy was not just a battle, it was a demonstration of what happens when coordination becomes a killing machine, when strategy, mathematics, and overwhelming firepower converge to erase even the strongest defenders from the map. The Germans had learned, painfully and methodically, that survival on the modern battlefield meant disappearing into the earth. Foxholes, trenches, bunkers carved into frozen soil. These were the last thin barriers between a man and oblivion. Veterans taught new recruits how deep to dig, how to angle the walls, how to lie flat when the shells began to fall. Dirt was life. Sky was death. But in the winter of 1944, that equation collapsed. The Americans introduced a shell so advanced, so unnatural in its precision, that even hiding underground stopped working. The first time it was used, the soldiers didn't understand what was happening. There was no familiar thud of impact, no geyser of dirt erupting from the ground. Instead, the forest canopy and open fields erupted in bursts of light and metal, as if invisible hands were detonating bombs in midair. These shells carried a device called the VT proximity fuse, a miniature radar packed inside the nose of a speeding artillery round. As the shell descended, it emitted radio waves, measuring its distance to the ground. When it reached the perfect height, it detonated automatically, scattering thousands of jagged fragments downward in a lethal rain. For the men in foxholes, it felt like the earth itself had turned against them. Shrapnel poured straight down, piercing helmets, slicing through shoulders, shredding limbs that were never exposed before. A trench that once shielded a soldier from horizontal blasts now became a narrow trap where there was nowhere to dodge the rain of metal. Men curled into the mud, screaming, hands over their heads, feeling impacts all around them, convinced that the sky had learned how to aim. The Battle of the Bulge became the proving ground for this terrifying invention. When German forces surged through the Ardennes forest in a desperate bid to split the Allied lines, American units were caught off guard. Roads clogged with refugees, artillery units retreating, infantry scrambling to hold ground that barely existed on the maps. The winter was brutal, the forests thick, visibility poor. German troops believed the trees would shield them from artillery. They believed foxholes would protect them from shells. They were wrong. When American artillery commanders switched to proximity-fused rounds, the battlefield transformed instantly. Shells detonated in the treetops, showering entire platoons with steel fragments. Snow fell red. Forests echoed with the screams of wounded men who had never even seen the enemy. Entire formations froze in place, unable to advance, unable to retreat, as the air itself became a minefield. Soldiers described it as fighting a ghost. No gunfire to trace, no enemy to shoot at, just explosions blooming above their heads with mechanical precision. General George Patton, watching reports flood in from the front, realized what this meant. In letters and after-action reports, he would later credit the proximity fuse with saving thousands of American lives. One barrage alone was estimated to have killed or incapacitated hundreds of attacking German soldiers in minutes, halting a breakthrough that might have shattered the Allied front. To Patton, it was proof that science, not just bravery, would decide the war. To the Germans, it felt like witchcraft. Rumors spread through their ranks that the Americans had invented shells that could see. Some believed there were secret observers guiding every round from the clouds. Others whispered about radar-guided bombs, supernatural technology, or Allied scientists who had mastered physics beyond human understanding. Panic followed. Units that had held firm against tanks and bombers broke under artillery that could strike anywhere, anytime, from above. Soldiers surrendered simply to escape the sky. In the quiet moments after the barrages, survivors crawled from shattered trenches and stared upward, as if expecting the clouds themselves to attack again. Veterans who had fought in Poland, France, Russia, and North Africa admitted they had never experienced anything like it. Traditional artillery could be endured. Proximity-fused artillery could not. It erased the basic instincts that had kept men alive for centuries. Digging deeper no longer helped. Hugging the ground no longer worked. The rules were gone. For the first time in history, the sky itself became a weapon, not just a place where planes flew, but an active participant in the slaughter. Every gust of wind, every rustling tree branch, every cloud felt hostile. The battlefield had expanded vertically, and nowhere, above or below, was safe anymore. And as the war ground toward its end, one truth became impossible to ignore. The future of warfare would not be decided by how bravely men fought in the mud, but by how intelligently nations learned to weaponize the air, the earth, and even time itself. By 1945, American artillery had become something unprecedented. A system so coordinated it could erase entire armies in minutes. What began as theories on chalkboards and calculations on slide rules had evolved into a doctrine that reshaped warfare itself. As Allied forces pushed toward Germany, the battlefield no longer felt like chaos. Felt engineered. When Allied armies reached the Rhine, the final natural barrier protecting the heart of Germany, the Americans decided to demonstrate the full scale of what they had built. As assault boats lined the riverbanks and bridges were prepared, artillery batteries stretched for miles in every direction. At the signal, they unleashed a storm that few humans had ever witnessed. 60,000 shells per hour screamed across the river, slamming into German positions, command posts, and defensive lines. The ground shook so violently that observers compared it to an earthquake that refused to stop. Generals Dwight Eisenhower and William Simpson stood on the banks and watched the bombardment with a mixture of awe and calculation. This was not just a battle, it was an industrial process. Each shell had been timed, coordinated, and calculated. Each battery was a node in a vast network of fire. Infantry crossed under a protective umbrella of explosions, while German defenders, already exhausted and outnumbered, were reduced to shadows clinging to shattered earth. The Rhine, once a symbol of German security, became a line erased by mathematics. After the war, German officers were interviewed about what had broken their armies. Many expected tanks, bombers, or the Red Army to top the list. Instead, again and again, they pointed to American artillery. They described it as omnipresent, instantaneous, and psychologically crushing. You could not outmaneuver it, could not anticipate it, could not escape it. It was not just firepower, it was inevitability. The Americans had embraced a doctrine that other nations would later study, copy, and refine. Overwhelming, coordinated firepower delivered faster than the enemy could comprehend. War was no longer about individual heroics or brilliant charges. It was about systems, logistics, communication, computation, and timing. Artillery became part of an industrial assembly line, where destruction was produced with the same precision as machinery in a factory. The battlefield became a production floor, and casualties were outputs of a process optimized for speed and scale. This philosophy did not end in 1945. It became the foundation of modern warfare. From Cold War artillery doctrines to precision-guided munitions, from network drones to satellite-guided strikes, the same principle endures. Reduce the enemy's time to react to zero. Remove uncertainty. Turn war into a calculated sequence where outcomes are determined before the first shot is fired. The legacy of those early fire direction centers lives on in modern command and control systems, in digital targeting networks, and in doctrines that prioritize speed and coordination over brute force alone. The men at Fort Sill never charged a hill or crossed a river under fire. Their weapons were pencils, radios, charts, and equations. They did not become legendary battlefield heroes, and their names are rarely remembered outside military history circles. Yet their impact was as devastating as any tank division or bomber fleet. They transformed artillery from scattered guns into a single synchronized mind that could think, decide, and kill faster than any human opponent. For the soldiers on the receiving end, it was something beyond fear. It was the realization that war itself had changed, that survival no longer depended on courage or instinct, but on whether a man happened to stand in the wrong coordinates at the wrong millisecond. They remembered the silence before the storm, the eerie calm that meant calculations had already been made, that shells were already in the air, that fate had already been decided by distant officers and invisible equations. The men at Fort Sill didn't become heroes. They didn't fire a single shot. But with mathematics and timing, they changed how wars are fought forever. And for the soldiers who heard the silence before the storm, hell was not as bad as what they experienced.